On a humid Monday morning, Malcolm Carter, a name unfamiliar to most but respected by many, stepped out of his modest sedan and into the quiet town of Oak Ridge. Malcolm was a seasoned civil rights attorney known for his relentless pursuit of justice. However, this wasn't his usual battle. This was personal. He was here for his father, Thomas Carter, a black veteran who had been hospitalized after a brutal encounter with the police. The streets of Oak Ridge were serene, almost deceptively so. Malcolm's arrival came on the heels of a tragedy that had shaken the town. His father, a man who had served his country with distinction, was now fighting for his life in a hospital bed. The incident had sparked outrage, and Malcolm was determined to uncover the truth and hold those responsible accountable. Thomas Carter was well known in Oak Ridge, a war veteran in his 50s. He was a pillar of the community, often seen mentoring young men at the local community center. On the night of the incident, he had been walking home from one such meeting when a police cruiser pulled up beside him. Inside the vehicle was Sergeant Richard Hayes, a man with a reputation for being tough, but whose methods had come under scrutiny over the years. Hayes stepped out of his car, his demeanor immediately confrontational. "Where are you headed this time of night?" he asked, his voice tinged with condescension. "Just heading home, officer," Thomas replied calmly. Despite the hostility in Hayes' tone, Thomas's military discipline kept him composed. But Hayes wasn't satisfied. "Show me some ID," he demanded. Thomas hesitated, his hands visible. "Officer, I'm just trying to get home. There's no need for this." Hayes interpreted the hesitation as defiance. With escalating aggression, he reached for Thomas, who instinctively stepped back. That small act was all Hayes needed to justify his actions. He struck Thomas, forcing him to the ground with unwarranted force. By the time backup arrived, Thomas was barely conscious, his face bruised and swollen. The medics rushed him to the hospital as Hayes stood nearby, the reality of his actions beginning to weigh on him. But the damage was done, and Thomas slipped into a coma before reaching the emergency room. Malcolm arrived at the hospital hours later, his heart heavy with dread. As he walked through the sterile hallways, he was met with whispers and sidelong glances. He was used to the attention. His work had made him a recognizable figure, but this was different. This was his father. Inside the room, Thomas lay motionless, his face nearly unrecognizable beneath the bandages and bruises. A doctor briefed Malcolm on his father's condition, explaining that the next 48 hours were critical. Malcolm sat by his father's side, anger and grief coursing through him. He couldn't let this stand. Malcolm's network of activists, journalists, and attorneys quickly mobilized. Within hours, the story broke, and protests erupted outside the Oak Ridge Police Department. The town, usually quiet and uneventful, became the epicenter of a national conversation about police brutality and racial injustice. Sergeant Hayes watched the unfolding chaos from his home, a mix of fear and defiance brewing within him. He had faced complaints before, but nothing like this. The presence of Malcolm Carter made it clear that this was no ordinary case. As protests swelled, Malcolm filed a lawsuit against Hayes and the Oak Ridge Police Department, citing excessive force and racial discrimination. His investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern: complaints against Hayes that had been ignored or buried by the department. The system had protected him for years, but Malcolm was determined to change that. The trial was a media sensation. Malcolm's opening statement set the tone. "This is not just about my father. This is about every person who has been targeted, harassed, and hurt by those sworn to protect them. This ends now." For weeks, the courtroom was filled with witnesses, evidence, and testimonies that painted a damning picture of Hayes' history. Journalists dug into the department's practices, exposing a culture of silence and complicity. While the trial progressed, Thomas's condition slowly improved. The doctors were cautious but optimistic. Malcolm visited him daily, sharing updates and drawing strength from his father's resilience. When the verdict finally came, the tension was palpable. The jury found Hayes guilty on multiple charges, including assault and misconduct. The police department was ordered to undergo a comprehensive review and implement reforms. The courtroom erupted in applause. But for Malcolm, It was only the beginning. Months after the trial, Malcolm was approached by Henry Morales, the newly appointed interim police chief. Morales, a reform-minded leader, sought Malcolm's help in rebuilding the department's trust with the community. Though hesitant, Malcolm saw this as an opportunity to create lasting change. As a special advisor, Malcolm led diversity training workshops, established community outreach programs, and implemented policies for greater accountability. He worked tirelessly, even as he continued to visit his father, who was slowly regaining his strength. One day, Thomas surprised Malcolm by attending a town hall meeting. Leaning on his cane, he addressed the crowd, his voice steady despite the scars he bore. "I served my country believing in freedom and justice for all," he said. "But for too long, those values haven't been true for everyone. My son didn't just fight for me, he fought for every person in this town. Together, we can make justice a reality." The room erupted in applause, and Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. His father's strength inspired him to push forward, knowing the fight was far from over. Over the years, Oak Ridge transformed. Crime rates dropped, trust in the police improved, and the community became more unified. Malcolm established the Thomas Carter Justice Initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of police violence and advocating for systemic reform. The initiative quickly gained national recognition, with chapters opening across the country. Thomas became a symbol of resilience, speaking at events and sharing his story. "Real change starts with seeing each other's humanity," he often said, his words resonating deeply. Malcolm's work extended internationally, inspiring audiences around the world. His father's ordeal had sparked a movement, and together, they had shown that justice was possible with perseverance and unity. One evening, as Malcolm prepared for a keynote speech, he was joined by Chief Morales, now retired. Morales commended him, saying, "You and your father changed everything. Oak Ridge is a better place because of you both." Later, Malcolm stood on stage, his father seated proudly in the front row. "We must never accept injustice as inevitable," he told the audience. "Change starts with our voices, our resilience, and our willingness to stand together. My father taught me that strength isn't about battles we fight, but the lives we touch and the justice we pursue." The crowd rose in a standing ovation, their applause echoing a legacy of hope and change. For Malcolm and Thomas, the fight for justice had been grueling, but it had also been worth every sacrifice. Together, they had left an indelible mark, proving that even in the face of darkness, resilience and unity could light the way forward.